StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।
Talk to the middle classes of Delhi and you will say pollution is bad. But their answer to air pollution is stop the farmers in Punjab and Haryana.
That is essentially regulating industries from the environment perspective.
Firstly, we are not regulating industry. In fact, your pollution control boards have become spineless, if I may say, and be blunt about it. Tell me anybody who's gone to jail because of pollution.
Well, now, river Yamuna has dissolved oxygen almost zero. It's a dead river, and you have mentioned this previously, that we are yet to cremate the river as such.
When I say Yamuna is dead, it's not because of some emotive language. It is actually dead.
Environmentalism in India is now becoming an elitist issue.
You've really caught my words very well. The forest officer of the districts should be more important than the Indian Administrative Service officer. So why are we worried about forests? Please cut trees. Every time I grow a tree as a poor farmer and I want to do sandalwood farming, you will put 100 conditions on me for transporting that sandalwood. This podcast is designed for aspirants. I think they have to understand how critical the role of public policy is.
Ladies and gentlemen, the environment isn't something that is just out there. It is in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and it is something that will definitely determine our future. Welcome to this special podcast on StudyIQ IAS. One where we will cut through all the noise and get to the heart of understanding what it means to survive and thrive in 21st century India. In an age where development means deforestation, where the poor pay the price for the rich, our guest today has been a tireless voice for environmental protection and conservation. She is one of India's fiercest environmental advocates, a Padma Shri awardee, and the force behind the much acclaimed Down to Earth and Gobar Times magazines. An individual who wears multiple hats with consummate ease. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sunita Narain, the Director General of Center for Science and Environment. Dr. Narain, thank you for joining us here at StudyIQ.
Happy to be with you. Very important podcast.
Thank you, ma'am. Before we begin this discussion where I intend to cover the entire gamut from rotis to rainforest, let me begin with what could be considered to be a very simple question. Is India doing enough to deal with the problem of climate change?
So no country is doing enough. Let's be absolutely clear about this. Climate change is a reality. We are seeing it in the face of extreme weather events, which are devastating large parts of our world, particularly India. The poor are the most vulnerable. We know that. And no country is doing enough. In the case of India, the challenges are even more because we have to increase development, we need growth, and yet we know that growth as it is today will be bad for local environment and also bad for climate change. So for us, the challenge is how do you reinvent growth? Because growth is essential. We have large numbers of people who are still very poor. We have large numbers of people who live without electricity today. We have millions of women who still cook their food on dirty biomass fuel. And you cannot argue that India does not need growth. But in today's scenario where we have climate change and we know the existential crisis of climate change, and we know that the rest of the world, particularly the rich countries of the world, have not stepped up the act, the question is, how can we do more in our own interests?
So when we talk about, say, the effects of climate change on Indian public, on the Indian population, how does one begin to understand the effects of that for a population that is struggling with the roti, kapda, makan problem?
So, that's a question that I've often been asked. And it's also very important. It is important for us to re-look at what do we mean by environment. So there are two distinct environmentalisms of the world. So there is an environmentalism that we have inherited from the rest of the world, where environment became a concern after there was development. So after you got your roti, kapda, makan, you you realize that in the effort to get your roti kapda makan, you created huge environmental impact. You destroyed your water systems. You had toxins in the air. You had toxins in your food. And so you decided that environment was important. That is what I call the environmentalism of the middle class. The environmentalism of a country like India is very different, because for us, we know that environment is actually our resource base. And it's a resource base for millions of people who get their livelihood. Their survival depends on the health of the environment. Their survival depends on the quality of water that they get from the tube well, from the river. If that is contaminated, they get diarrhea. And today, cholera and diarrhea are still one of the biggest baby killers in India. So for us, water pollution is not an aesthetic issue. It's not even an issue that the middle class, people like you and me, we really don't care whether our river is polluted, because we drink bottled water. But for millions of people in this country, basic survival depends on the health of the environment. If your soils are depleted, if your soils are undernourished, if your soils cannot regenerate and give you high productivity, farmers lose out. You need to have good manure. For good manure, you need good fodder. For good fodder, you need forests, you need grazing lands. So the interconnection of life in India, survival in India, development in India is on environment. So for us, the environmental challenge is not after we have had development, but how do we do development so that that environmental wealth, that natural resource wealth that we have, on which life depends, is not depleted.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Narain, you mentioned about, say, the problem becoming slightly elitist, if I'm not wrong. Mm-hmm. So are we running that risk that environmentalism in India is now becoming an elitist issue rather than a mass issue?
You've really caught my words very well and very, very smart. I wouldn't say it's becoming an elitist issue today, but it concerns me. Mm-hmm. Because we can't afford to go the Western way of environmentalism. You can see today, even now, they have not fixed their environmental problem. They're always a step behind. They have massive challenges of fixing water pollution, air pollution, soil degradation, and all the time they're investing massive amounts of money in technology and improvement. We don't have those options. And the environmentalism of the middle class is always about being a step behind the problem. Mm-hmm. The environmentalism of the poor is how to secure the future of livelihoods based on the environment. I mean, one of the big issues that if you look at middle class issues today, we talk about air pollution in Delhi. Let me cut the chase and get to the real issue. Yeah. We talk about air pollution in Delhi. But when I talk to the middle class, and you will talk to the middle classes of Delhi, and you will say, pollution is bad. And it's good that middle classes are aware of it today. They see it on their phones, they're worried, they're anguished, they care about the health of their children. That's good. But their answer to air pollution is stop the farmers in Punjab and Haryana from burning. They don't look at their cars being the source of the pollution in the city. Because the minute you talk about reducing the number of cars, you talk about having a parking charge on the car, you will invariably get an answer, but I'm not the problem. I have a brand new car which has very high pollution standards. But they don't understand that every car which has high pollution standards, which is good, but the fact is you add 5 more cars and you negate that pollution standard. Right. So we are not understanding, that's really what the Western world has never understood. The Western world, when it talks about climate change, never talks about public transport. Because they never talk about these issues, because for them, the minute you talk about them, they say their people will get, their own populations will turn against environment. But for us, we have no option. We have to reinvent today. We can't talk about this after we've destroyed all our forests and our land and our rivers talk about the need for better management. So we have to rethink today.
Dr. Narain, when you mention about the Delhi problem, the Delhi air pollution problem, now allow me to play the devil's advocate here, but the middle class is going to come back and say that, look, I have a vehicle that is meeting the so-called pollution standards.
Yeah.
Now, on just say the 10-year benchmark, the 10-year time period for the diesel vehicles, one day before it is acceptable to drive on the vehicle, drive on the roads, the next day it is outlawed. So it's going to come back and say, look, why are you penalizing me only?
So frankly, that law, I don't think is a good law. Okay, I mean, to say that the middle class vehicle must be or any vehicle based on age should be removed from the roads was not something that when I was a member of the EPCA, which was the Environment Protection Authority, reporting to the Supreme Court, we never took this matter as a policy to the court, because we believed this was only lead to, yes, it's very beneficial for the automobile industry because you can sell more cars, but at the end of the day, the second-hand car market is going to move to any other part of the country. Pollution is going to increase there as well. You need a better system for the management of the emissions from the vehicles. For that, you need better on-road emission standards. You need to make sure that you have a PUC system which is much more rigorous, and you need to make sure that people have alternatives so that they don't need to drive the car. I mean, today, I'm sure all of us would prefer not to be sitting in traffic and in congestion. But we have no option, because if you take a bus, it is also stuck in traffic. It is far better for you to have more reliable transport than to have unreliable transport. If you take a metro, your cost goes up because your last mile connectivity doesn't exist. So we need to think about these things in a more holistic manner. And I agree with you. I am not in favor of such a law which puts the burden on the middle class, or any car owner. But I would argue with that same car owner that please understand I drive a car, so I'm part of the problem, okay? All of us who are in cars today are a minuscule minority in the cities. In the city of Delhi, only 15% people commute by car, only 15%. Yet we occupy 95% of the road space. And more roads are coming up, more flyovers are coming up, and even as the new flyover comes up, cars fill it up. Okay? Congestion increases. As congestion increases, pollution goes up. So we have to understand the role of automobiles in the local air pollution crisis. As we understand pollution is a risk and it concerns the health of our children, we have to understand that we also will have to fight for the change. I know it is easier said than done. I cannot tell people not to drive because I know that the state of our public transport is not one in which you can easily shift. But on the other hand, that's what the fight has to be. That's what we have to start asking for. Our right to clean air is about our right to walk, our right to cycle, our right to take a bus, our right to cross a road. I mean, please understand a very simple logic that we forget. You can't take a bus if you can't cross the road with safety. Mm-hmm. If you don't have street lights at night, how do women take public transport? So there's all these interconnections, which is all about governance. And particularly as this podcast is designed for aspirants who want to be part of the governance of this country, I think they have to understand how critical the role of public policy is, how critical the role of governance is, and public institutions are. Mm-hmm. Because for too long we have decimated these thinking, let the private sector do it, and minimal government, minimal governance is what we need. Today, the crisis of environment is about the crisis of the lack of public institutions with governance and deterrence.
Dr. Narain, at StudyIQ, we often talk with our students in environment and geography classes. And regarding this point that you raised, one of the primary criticisms of the governance model is that it is often knee-jerk and incomplete, so to say. For example, when you consider the Delhi pollution problem, Now you see this outrage happening only during the winter seasons, when I'm sure you will agree that you require consistent efforts throughout the year.
Absolutely.
Similarly, when you allude to, say, having sidewalks and say right to cycling, now the students counter that and say that, look, we are in a tropical country where it is almost impossible to walk, let alone cycle. So how do you manage that? Because that's an obvious governance challenge.
Let me take that. Yeah, we're in a tropical country, but there are people who cycle in the coldest of countries, no? So, I think, a lot of it will be, and if you look at Delhi today, just Delhi, the most invisible user of your road today is the cyclist. Okay, do you know how much of Delhi cycles today? Take a guess.
Probably.
About 30%. Yes, that's government data. Ministry of Urban Affairs did a survey where they looked at the modal share of transport. And this may have decreased a bit in Delhi, but it is increasing in every city. And these are longer and longer distances, people. Now, they cycle because they have no option. Because even taking a bus is too expensive for people.
Right.
Okay? So that's survival cycling. Okay, rich countries cycle because it's a luxury and it's also exercise. Okay, that I cycle to work because it gives me the time for leisure and exercise, and I'm also on low carbon transport. So it's a different level. But my question is, why is it in a country like India where the bulk of the people cycle, they take a bus, they walk? Okay, why are we designing our cities only for roads, for motorists?
Right.
That is the governance crisis that you're talking about. And I totally agree with you. It is knee-jerk because we are losing institutions. How were policies made? Policies of, say, road management in a city. How are they made today? It's a question to be discussed. They're made today literally on the basis of that the traffic policeman on the road decides whether a U-turn should be there. Then you have PWD, which comes and does road widening. There are no skilled traffic planners who are involved. Today's governance model is about science being infused with policy. It is about technical knowledge to be taken to policy. We have silos today. Policy, science. Science does not infuse policy. Policy does not infuse science. Scientists work on their own. So you need governance in today and in future, more and more in the complicated world that we now have and will get more complicated. We need more sophisticated planning tools in which that planning of each part of development has to be done with a very high order of knowledge, very high order of follow through, and a very high order of learning from the mistakes you make. Yeah. No policy is ever going to be absolute. So you need systems of feedback loops where I did this, but it didn't work. Let me change this and bring it back. Some of the best policies in this country and some of the best bureaucrats that I have worked with are the ones who have always believed in learning, in feedback, and in constantly evolving policy. And I think that's the science and the art of policy making.
Dr. Narain, when you talk about, say, the governance and science and policy all working together, not in silos. Now, one criticism that arises from there is that in India today, you are looking at a model that is essentially regulating industries from the environment perspective rather than being pro-people. Is that a fair assessment to make?
No, I'm not sure how you say that. I mean, firstly, we are not regulating industry, okay? Ease of doing business means that you have your minimal regulation on industry today. In fact, your pollution control boards have become toothless, have become spineless, if I may say, and be blunt about it, and have become completely ineffective in doing the work that they were designed to do. I think it is something that is if you look at the crisis of environment today, I'm always talking about this, that the crisis of environment is the crisis of institutions and the disabling of institutions. I am not talking about a pollution control board which has very high levels of transaction costs, where every time an inspector goes to a factory, you know what happens, okay? I'm not talking about that. That's not governance. That's not the model of governance that either you want or all the people who are watching this program will want, okay? We want governance in this country which will make a difference. So you need smart tools, but you need institutions. Today, Indian industry is wanting to get three things. One, they want knowledge. They want to know what can they do better. Okay? But if they get that knowledge, they also know that to use the knowledge, there will be a cost to it. Now, the cost is borne by two things. One, if you have a deterrence, which is an effective pollution management system in which you would say, sir, you cannot pollute. You're using coal in your foundry. That coal has been banned in NCR. You will have to switch. Okay? Which means that there'll have to be a pressure of deterrence. But then there is also the question of, so what do? I run a small industry. I need to remain competitive. Okay? Do I move out of NCR, or do I find a method in which I can have my production, but in a way that is cleaner fuel? That's where the question becomes, is there a cleaner fuel option that you can get? Is there a technology which is affordable? Is there a tax incentive that can be given to you so that, say, you move to natural gas, your gas price is kept cheaper than the price of coal that you use? So that's the role of public policy. That's the role of incentives. And all that works if you have deterrence. So it's a package. If I have a stick but no carrot, the stick will not lead to action. If I have only carrots and no stick, it will only mean that people will get rich and do nothing about it.
So Dr. Narain, say the Environmental Protection Act, 1986, for the same example that you are referring to. So has that failed? Because that's supposed to be the guiding light in terms of environmental protection.
So I think it's an excellent act, okay? I'll be very clear. It was a very well-conceived act for the time it was brought in. It was an act that was brought in, as you know, post-Bhopal gas disaster. The country had woken up to a chemical disaster of a scale that we had never even thought was possible. I mean, just imagine. I went to Bhopal the very night after it had happened. And that image, I promise you, does not leave me, of the number of bodies on the ground with white cloth on them. I mean, it was just the very thought that modern industrialization could have such huge impact. And I think the Environment Protection Act was an act that was brought in very carefully to be able to bring action on environment protection. But we have not been able to do two things. One, we have not been able to bring the state and central acts together. So there is a multitude of acts. You have the Water Act, the Air Act, the EP Act, the Forest Act. A lot of these need synergy now. Number one. But the most important thing that is the failure of all these acts is we don't have penalties that work. Okay? Tell me anybody who's gone to jail because of pollution. Tell me the kind of fines. I mean, every day NGT declares one fine or the other. You start asking how much of that fine is actually paid. There is no data on it. Okay? So deterrence is part of governance. Penalties are part of governance. Now, every time we ask for that, and this is the failure, every time we talk about it, the answer is, if you raise the cost of penalties, you raise the cost of corruption. Okay? Because people, not to be able to avoid the penalty, will end up paying the money. That's the simple principle. But that's because we have not fixed corruption. Right. And corruption is not about human beings. I mean, you can't tell me that Indians are corrupt. Indians are not corrupt people. We don't have it in our genes to be corrupt. Huh? It's about the governance system that we have, which allows corruption to happen.
Right.
So we need to fix that rather than say we don't need deterrence. So EP Act, in my view, is an excellent piece of legislation. It has also evolved over the years. You have the environmental impact assessments which have come out of the EP Act. You have the plastic regulations which are part of the EP Act. You have the solid waste rules which are part of the EP Act. So the EP Act provided a good framework to allow for many issues to be built in. You didn't have to come up with separate legislations for each one. They're all part of the EP Act. But we need to make sure that we can now strengthen the Act from the point of view of convergence and from the point of view of institutional deterrence.
Dr. Narain, when you mention about the deterrence bit, now recently you had the Supreme Court that had put a fine on the Palar River that was unfortunately completely contaminated due to the tanneries in Tamil Nadu. Now, does that worry you that the Supreme Court is getting into this rather than, say, the NGT that you obviously have referred to has not done or not lived up to its potential?
No, I don't think we can see. NGT plays its role, Supreme Court plays its role. I mean, judiciaries play their role. The question that you have to ask is, why is the judiciary having to do this? Yes. That is the question that you have to ask.
Right.
Okay, and every time, because I have worked with the judiciary, I was a member of EPCA and I reported to the Chief Justice for many years, and a lot of the actions we took in Delhi were part of the Buralal Committee, which is, who is, as you know, a former bureaucrat, and I was a member of his committee, and we played a very effective role, and I believe, in guiding the court on technical decisions and follow through. But the question I would always be asked is, why is the court having to do this? And then there would be activist court. Why is the Chief Justice saying that that we need to ban coal in Delhi? Why is it that the pollution control boards are not doing it? And I think that's a fundamental question. Why did the court have to set this tax? At the end of the day, we know that these rivers are highly contaminated because of textile pollution. We also know that there are answers to tech. We need textile industry to grow in India. Okay, we don't want this industry to move to, say, Bangladesh because there the laws may be weaker. We don't want the industry to move to another part of the country. I mean, I'll give you an instance. I was asked recently by the High Court to look at jean dyeing. So, we all wear jeans, blue jeans, and there is an outskirt of Delhi called Shiv Vihar. And I was asked to look into, the court had ordered for the jean dyeings to be closed, the factories to be closed there, very much like what you're talking about. And because of the blue dye was contaminating the river Yamuna. So the drains from Shiv Vihar were carrying the blue dye into Yamuna. This matter was brought to the High Court of Delhi. The High Court passed an order. Then they asked me to be an amicus and asked me to go and check whether the factories were indeed closed and what could be done, because they were getting complaints. So when I went there, it was a fascinating case. I mean, I learned about a lot of things. These are things that really teach you about governance and the importance of doing things differently. So when I went to Shiv Vihar, and I was obviously, I had the pollution control board. Everyone was with me. Madam, all factories are closed. Look, everywhere there are locks. And then, of course, I looked down and there was blue dye in the water. So I said, but there's blue color here. Where is it coming from? So then they said, oh, the factories are closed. So we said, okay, let's follow the blue dye. So we followed it and we got, these are small lanes. These are unauthorized colonies. So you followed it and you went, and from the back, the factory was open. Now, I was obviously, how can you do this? The factory is open. How is the dyeing happening? Court order. Answer was very clear. Saying, madam, on that side, the factory is in Delhi. On the back side, the factory is in UP. Yeah. So the factory is operating legally from UP. The point is that Nala still flows through to Yamuna, even if the factory is operating from UP. Sure. Okay? But there was a larger message. The fact is, why is the dyeing happening there? Because the authorized areas where the regulations are there. I mean, the Pollution Control Board officials who came with me said, Madam, we can't do anything. I said, why? Because these are unauthorized areas. So I said, how does that matter? I said, if we act against a factory in an unauthorized area, we are authorizing the factory. We are saying the factory is legal. Please understand.
Yes.
Okay? That factory does not exist as far as we are concerned. Now, so what's happening in India is that you have authorized areas, industrial areas, where industry is operated. There the pollution control boards then have take action. There is a cost to that action. What does the factory owner do? They shift. Now this is exactly what the global world has done. Okay? This is exactly what's happening in Tamil Nadu. So in the authorized areas, if there are pollution and there is a cost to it, they will shift to a village, a more outskirt area. So your governance systems have to extend everywhere. You can't say to me that my governance is only in the areas which are an official area. This is the global model of globalization, where an American factory shifted to China because they could not afford the cost of pollution control. So they shifted it to China. We are shifting it from Delhi to first Shiv Vihar, and if Shiv Vihar gets under control, then to the UP part of Shiv Vihar. And if the Allahabad High Court comes down on the UP part of Shiv Vihar, it will move further into the outskirts. It will go more into the illegal, which will become even more difficult to track. But pollution will remain. We need to make sure that the courts are not the agents who will act on this. We need stronger institutions.
Ma'am, you refer to the river Yamuna and the Shiv Vihar example. Now, river Yamuna has dissolved oxygen almost zero. It's a dead river, and you have mentioned this previously, that we are yet to cremate the river as such. Do you see any hope for the river as such?
So please take a look, and I would, we have just released a paper on an action plan for Yamuna. I am basically arguing we can clean up Yamuna. We can, okay? But you will have to completely and radically change the actions you take. I'll give you some basic statistics. 22-kilometer stretch is the stretch of Delhi from Wazirabad to Okhla. That's the stretch through which Yamuna flows, 22 kilometers. 80% of the pollution of the river comes from this 22-kilometer stretch. 80% of the river's pollution comes from two drains, Najafgarh and Shadra. Okay? So, you have to understand how easy pollution control is. If you control 80% of the Delhi stretch, you've cleaned up Yamuna. Okay? If you control Najafgarh and Shadra, you've cleaned up Yamuna. Okay? Now, why is it not happening? Only in the last, the government of Delhi had put out data for 3 years, and they said they have spent 6,000 odd crores on cleaning up the river. Okay? And this is 22 kilometers. If you just put 6,000 crore over 22 kilometers, just come up with the maths yourself.
Per
okay?
kilometer,
Per kilometer. Okay?
300 crores, yes.
Exactly. Okay? And yet, if you look at data, Yamuna is only getting more and more contaminated. More quality of Yamuna is getting worse. When Yamuna enters Delhi at Wazirabad, its dissolved oxygen level is about 4 or 5, which means the river has life. The minute it comes to ISBT, that's the first monitoring station, Interstate Bus Terminal in Delhi, just a few kilometers as it enters, the dissolved oxygen level is 0. As I keep saying, science is, if a water body's dissolved oxygen is 0, it is dead. So when I say Yamuna is dead, it's not because of some emotive language. It is actually dead as per science. You just have not been able to deal with its pollution. Now, why? Because we have this notion of pollution control of our rivers, which has come from the West. in which they have intercepted sewage, taken it to a sewage treatment plant, cleaned it, and put clean water in a river. Now, we forget the fact that the bulk of our cities do not have access to underground sewerage. The bulk of our cities live in unauthorized colonies. The bulk of our cities live in non-sewered areas. So if you were to reinvent the Yamuna plan and say, I'm going to focus on intercepting every drop of sewage, okay, not building the sewage treatment plants is not my focus. Taking the sewage to the sewage treatment plant, yes, is my focus. But intercepting official, unofficial. Yes. Making sure that not a single drop of sewage enters the drain, which is treated sewage. So I reuse and recycle the sewage. So it's possible to clean the river. We just have to understand that we have to do it the Indian way, because the Indian reality is going to be different from the rest of the world.
Ma'am, now let's just move past Delhi. And if we talk about the country's forests now, it's our primary resource as such. And I would like to refer to the first act, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, which was recently amended, and which you have also criticized heavily for ignoring the quality of the forests and just focusing on the quantity per se. What's your assessment? Are we on target to reach that goal of 33% of the country's area under forest?
So why are we worried about forests? I mean, I think the forest debate in India needs to be revisited completely. So when I was a young activist and I went to the Chipko movement and met the women there, the forest issue was about their survival. It was about fodder they got from the forest for their land. It was about forests being linked to their needs. Okay? We then understood the role of forests from an ecosystem point of view. The fact that we needed forests for water security. We need forests for biodiversity. We need forests to maintain the soil levels in our for manure. So we understood the role of forests, and which is where, and so that's what so that's how we understood forestry in the mid-80s, and that came to the Forest Conservation Act. Forest Conservation Act at that stage was an act to stop the felling of forests, okay, because the crisis in the country was deforestation, okay, and the question there was, let's have a draconian act, and it is a draconian act, which literally said that for every forest that every hectare of forest that you would divert, you would need the permission of one person all the way in Delhi. Now, of course, it's changed to some extent, but the basic nature of that act was to say it is prohibitory in nature. Okay? Today, the challenge in India is how can we use our forests? We need the role of forests to be reinvented in India, because we are all about don't cut a tree, but please cut trees. We need to make furniture out of it. We need to do paper industry out of it. We need to use our forests well. Tell me, is it better to build a house out of steel and cement than bamboo? Just tell me.
Not at all. Obviously, the bamboo
is better, right?
Yes.
It is replenishable.
Sure.
You can grow it again.
Sure.
When you grow the bamboo, it will improve your soil fertility. It will give labor to people for growing it, for cutting it. Okay? It will give livelihoods to people when you harvest the bamboo. Okay? But in the nature of forestry today, it is all about let's not cut a tree. And when I say this, I can tell you, I actually get these faces in the room that look at me and say, what is she saying? She is talking about forest destruction. No, I am talking about forestry which has different purposes. So there is one forest purpose, which is I must not cut the biodiverse, pristine forests of India. I must make sure that the wildlife is secured in those forests. Those habitats must be secured. Okay? So Those are the forests which are the no-go areas, which are the no-touch areas, which are your sanctuaries, wildlife sanctuaries, your national parks, your biodiverse areas. Those should be where your watersheds of major rivers are. Those should not be touched, not for mining, not for development, not for anything. Sure. The people who live in those habitats should be compensated for maintaining those forests as forests. So that you have a method in which they also want to protect those forests, as standing forests. Because those forests are important to keep as forests. But then there are large areas of land where we should be growing, cutting, growing, cutting, growing, cutting, and harvesting. Today, India depends on every other country of the world for its forest and log needs. We are destroying other countries' forests. Right. We are buying furniture from every other country, okay? Because we won't touch our forests. Why won't we touch our forests? Because we are worried that if we cut the forest, we won't be able to regrow the forest. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we have a very high animal population density in India. So if I grow a tree, the goat will come and eat it up. And my survival rate is not going to work. And if I build a fence, I make a forest. I mean, you are very well aware of this. The system is to make a trench or a wall. I have not seen any wall, any trench that villagers, the goats are not able to cross. Okay? So the only way to do forestry is to make sure that they have an interest in the trees you grow. So India had this amazing experiment, if you remember, JFM, Joint Forest Management, yes, in the early 90s, yeah, as way back as 90s, early 90s, yes, okay? Now, it failed. It started from West Bengal, I believe. It started from, yes, went to Vindapur, yes, to look at the way, and in fact, it was a role model for the rest of the country, yes, to learn from Midnapur, where such degraded lands were turned into forests by making sure that you built forestry with the involvement of people. Sure. But the entire program failed. Why did it fail? Because at the end of the day, we failed to secure the long-term interests of people in forestry. When the final check was written to give the harvested wood to the people, the value of the check, and I'm telling you, these numbers are mind-boggling that you would actually do this, was 1 rupee in many cases, 5 rupees, 100 rupees. Why? Because you take all the timber and then you minus from it all the establishment costs, all this cost, that cost, net ultimate check goes to the village is 1 rupee. Okay? Where is the interest? I've spent my labor in protecting that forest. I've kept my animal out of it. Yes, I've got some fodder from it. Yes, I've got some minor forest produced from it. But where is the interest that I have to make sure next time you come, then I'm going to entertain you? You lost the trust of people. Mm-hmm. So we need to come back to a forestry with people now. And for that, we need to deregulate forests. We need to have the confidence to say, grow your tree and cut it. Today, the Supreme Court has said that even if 50 trees have to be cut in Delhi, you will have to take the permission of the CEC. Do you know the impact of that today? Nobody in Delhi, no land owning agency in Delhi wants to grow a tree. Why? Because if a tree grows, and you know the definition of a tree, sure, the minute it passes a certain girth, it becomes a tree. Sure. Okay? They say, फिर हमें permission लेनी पड़ेगी. You can't make forestry into a prohibitory effort. You make forestry into a developmental effort. The forest officer of the districts of almost half of Indian districts should be more important than the Indian administrative service officer. But then the role of the forest officer has to be development. Not just being a territorial licensed Raj person. So we have to change the nature of forestry. Not happening. Not happening. I mean, in all my life, I have argued for a lot of things, and some things happen. But in the case of forestry, I find there is such resistance. When I did the Tiger Task Force for the last Prime Minister, and he gave me the task of looking at what should we do with tigers in India after we learned that Sariska had lost its last tiger. And I came up with a plan which was both in terms of strengthening the systems within the tiger reserves. I also looked at how we could improve the money that went to tiger reserves. But my larger message was that the bulk of Indian tigers don't live in the tiger reserve. They live outside the tiger reserves. Yes. And your contiguous nature of your forest means that you have to involve local communities in the management of the tiger. I also, at that time, when I made the presentation to the Prime Minister, I actually showed him, my most favorite is this map of India. So if you take the map of India, you have the forests of India going. So I'm just, from the south, you have the Eastern Ghats, you have the Western Ghats. They come on this side, both sides over here. And then, of course, you have the Himalayas on top. That's the forests of India, okay? If I superimpose on it, where the poorest people of India live, it's in the forest districts of India. If I superimpose on it where the Naxalism has grown, it is in the forest areas of India. And if I superimpose on it where the tigers are, where the mineral wealth is, where the water wealth is, it is all in this forests of India. So a different future is needed where a development paradigm, you cannot do conservation on the backs of the poorest. You cannot do forest conservation against the will of people. And that, I think, is going to be the most important lesson going forward. That is why, for me, I have stopped looking at forest statistics. It means nothing to me.
So the Indian State Forest Report recently published.
It's a great report to tell you, yes, we are protecting our forests. Overall, the numbers look okay to me. You can quibble about that definition of forest. You and I all know that the pristine forests are going down. We all know that the quality of forests inside forests is not as important today as the forest outside. That actually 10% of the forest wealth of India is in trees that are grown in the lands of the poorest people of India. Okay?
The trees outside forest.
Exactly.
Yes.
All that we all know. Mm-hmm. But every time I grow a tree as a poor farmer and I want to do sandalwood farming, you will put 100 conditions on me for transporting that sandalwood. So I think that's the point.
Ma'am, when you talk about, say, the forests and the poverty being linked together, somewhere do you feel that the Forest Rights Act also has not lived up to its potential? Because you have state governments that are diluting their acts through their own acts.
So, I think the Forest Rights Act is a brilliant piece of legislation. But it was half the story. It is not about the right to land. It is the right to livelihood that needed to be secured. So when I've been to tribal lands, as you have, I'm sure, you would know that these are the poorest lands on which tribals live. Most of them are lateritic lands. They are very poor in productivity, and they have been pushed out, and they are living on these lands because they have no alternative. Now, absolutely right that they should have been given the right to their land. I am totally in favor of the Forest Rights Act. So please, I know my own community, and at that time I was doing the Tiger Report when the Tribal Act was coming, and I was under a lot of criticism for supporting the Forest Rights Act. But I strongly believe that that was a historical injustice that needed to be fixed. Mm-hmm. However, as I'm saying, it's half the story. If I've given a poor tribal the right to the land, which is very low in productivity, how is it improving livelihoods? What should have been done with the Forest Rights Act after the Forest Rights Act is really how can that poor household improve the productivity of the land. And a lot of it would be that those lands are not fit for agriculture. So what could you do to improve forests? What could you do to improve the livelihoods that the people would get now that they have the right to the land? If I have the right to the land, you know that the changing nature of it is unlike a common land where a lot of people have to work together. This is my land. I will protect my land. Okay? So why could I not get that additional help to move it towards livelihood support? Today, the Forest Rights Act has just become another one of those pieces of paper. State governments don't like it because it's giving community people the rights which when a development project comes, they need to take the consent of that person and that community to clear the project. Okay, so it just become a legislation which is inconvenient. But again, it could have been a legislation which was developmental in nature. It's the same with Manrega. My most favorite piece of legislation is Manrega. The right to employment secures a floor on poverty. Okay? I mean, so my most favorite example has been, I learned about Manrega when I went to see, and I'm talking about late 80s, when the drought of India was, when there was a very bad drought in India. And my colleague Anil Agarwal and I were traveling, looking at what could be done. And we chanced upon this man whose name you would have never heard, called V.S. Page. I'll never forget him. In the Maharashtra Mantralaya, going into his office, musty little office, he was a man who thought through the employment guarantee scheme of the state of Maharashtra. Why? Because in 1972, there was a famine, and people were worried that large numbers of people would leave villages and come to the city, create a crisis in the city. Brilliant piece of legislation to say the people would pay a professional tax, the people in Maharashtra living in cities would pay a tax, which would go to fund employment generation in villages of Maharashtra. That was the beginning of the Manrega. Sure. Today, when Manrega came, it's a great opportunity to use it for development. Not for employment, but for development. Because you are basically using the labor of very poor people to build water security in the village, to build improvement in fodder, to talk about what you could do with value addition for small scale industry. Sure. But the entire, and there have been efforts, and it is incredible to see where people have done this, where good officers have done this, that you can actually reverse migration. But overall, Manrega has just become a scheme in which you pay people to dig stones, to build a water harvesting structure, which will get destroyed in the next rain, so that that same structure can be repeated again. So I think that's the development nature of governance for many of these schemes, whether it's in forestry, whether it's in this, the convergence has to start happening.
Earlier in the interview, ma'am, you alluded to the role of the Indian Forest Service. So I have just two questions that originate and come to my mind. Firstly, is there a need for the Indian Forest Service to now evolve into the Indian Environment Service? And second, in my interactions with the forest guards that I have often spoken about, they often say that, look, we are putting our lives at stake to protect the biodiversity and the forests, and yet we never qualify for any gallantry award per se. So I don't have any skin in the game. I'm just going to do my duty and get out of it. So is there a way to combat it?
So the first question, I don't think Indian Forest Service should graduate in being Indian Environment Service. But I think the Indian Forest Service should become the Indian Forest Development Service. It's not about conservation only, it's about development. Foresters play a critical role. I think 33% of India's 23% of India's land area is officially under forests. Okay? Massive. massive, massive livelihood options that need to be secured. The whole world today is talking about how climate change, the answer for climate change is going to be to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. How do you remove carbon dioxide? By growing trees. Okay? Today, the world is talking about building wood-based houses. You go to UK, they will show you with great pride how their governments are now building house after house using wood. So you are getting to see today the role of forestry is changing, as you and I talked about. So for me, it's about the evolving nature. I really strongly believe that the Indian Forest Service is an exceptional service, because here are people who come to the service because of their commitment to environment, and they come to the service knowing that this is a role that they can play. So they are exceptional, they are important people. They need a new framing to be done for the work that they do, so that they can be equal partners. Today, an Indian Forest Service officer is always looked down upon in a district. As I'm arguing with you, I think they need to be even more important in a district because of the development role they play. So I think that's where, to me, the service needs to go. On the issue of forest guards, you've picked up a very good question. When I did the report on the Tiger Task Force, it was called Joining the Dots. Please take a look at it, and you will find that I actually looked at the age of guards, and I looked at the qualification, age of rangers and guards in our forest service. And that time I was looking at the wildlife service. And actually you will find that the age of guards is going up and up and up, because we were getting less and less recruitment. You were also finding that we were literally losing all our ranger colleges. Okay? So you're getting a top-heavy service and nothing below. Okay? The other problem is that every time you do a recruitment for the guards and rangers, you get a PhD who then goes and becomes a guard, who then looks for something else to do and not want to stay in the service. So you need to fix the role of the guard. But most importantly, you need to recognize that they play a critical role. In fact, when we had done our report on the Tiger Task Force, we had argued, and you will see in the recommendations, that we had said that the revenue that is earned from each one of the tiger reserves should be maintained in the tiger reserve or the wildlife reserve and not go into the general receipt of the state government, which is now beginning to happen. But we had said half that money should go to local communities and half should go to guards. Their welfare needs to be protected, their housing, their security, their future, their children's future. They are literally your frontier. They are your soldiers. And they need to come from the local community. That was another part of our recommendation, that hire guards from communities. Let them know that they are part, this is their future. These forests are there, they are custodians of these forests. Right. One of the most interesting examples that we had quoted was from Periyar in Kerala, where the forest department had actually so they had this real severe problem of sandalwood smugglers. But those people really knew the forest, and these were poachers, they knew the forest. They gave them the option of becoming part of the Periyar Sanctuary to say, you will run the wildlife tourism trade over here. Because if you take the tourists out, they really get the experience of wildlife. You know the forest at the back of your hand. So you need to create these new systems. Some very interesting examples are happening. Some examples are happening where people are using honey collectors to grow honey as forest cooperatives that are growing. So there are things happening in the country. We need to bring these together.
Dr. Narain, as we wrap up this conversation, thank you for reminding us that environment is not just a mere chapter in the syllabus of our textbooks, and more so, it's not just even a bullet point in a manifesto. It is the very existence, the purpose of our existence, in fact. Thank you, Dr. Narain, for your voice, your fire. You have inspired us all, and we hope that you continue to inspire all of us going into the future. Thank you for joining us here on StudyIQ.
Thank you. It was a fascinating conversation, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।